And just want to go here. Okay, we'll just give a minute for people to get on in here. And I'll just get my PowerPoint ready for you guys. All right, well, we've got about half of you. Just through chat, can you just let me know if you can hear my voice? Okay. All right, good, good. Just wanted to make sure. Of course, if you couldn't hear my voice, you wouldn't hear me ask that question, but all right. So today we are going to continue on with, there we go. We're going to continue on with talking about population ecology. So we did all the calculations last class, and you had a calculation assignment that was due to me. Hopefully I should be able to have that marked and back to you by tomorrow. We will see. I won't be giving you an assignment today, but you will get an assignment on probably on Thursday that'll be due on Monday, and that's on the rest of the population ecology stuff. Monday through Wednesday, you'll have your populations unit exam, and then we're done with populations. So we will finish populations off on Friday, and then Monday we're starting with endocrine system, which is a body system all about hormones. All right, any questions? All right then. So I will continue on then, and we will start the PowerPoint. Larkin's asking if there's a quiz up right now. Yes, there's a population genetics quiz that opened yesterday at noon and closes tomorrow at noon. So that's, I think I have it. I think that's what I did. Yeah, yesterday at noon and closes tomorrow at noon. And that's for population genetics. Okay, any other questions? All right, then we will look at some population ecology. All right, and do that. Let's just get this to where we want it to be. And we ended here. All right, so can you guys just see what we're looking at with the PowerPoint? Awesome. Okay, so let us talk about population dynamics. So changing populations, we did a bunch of math with that already, and all of those equations are sitting on your data sheet. And I told you some changes to make with some of the equations, which you should have already put on your data sheet as well, because obviously everything we do is open book. So you'll have that for your quizzes. So just different types of populations. So an open population is more what we find in nature. So this is a natural population, and this is where those 4 conditions we learned about that affect population size all impact those populations. So how many are born, how many die, how many come into the population, how many leave the population, okay? So that's what we see just in a normal population here on our planet. Now, we can also have a closed population. Now, closed population means that we don't have any immigration or emigration, right? So individuals can't come in or can't come out. So this isn't really a natural population unless we have a species that's maybe stuck on an island. So for example, Darwin's finches, right? So they got stuck on an island. So now they're more of a closed population. So they're just within themselves, which means the only thing that's going to affect that population, because if individuals can't come in and can't leave, the only other things that are going to affect the population size is the birth and the death of individuals within that population. Okay. Are man-made examples of this zoos and aquariums. And then we could really close a population and cut it off so it can't get any removal of waste or any nutrients. So this isn't really a realistic population. I do have an example of that. So when I worked in the lab, I would grow samples of bacteria, and I would grow them in test tubes. So they'd be growing in the culture in the test tube. And the test tube would have medium in it that had nutrients. So I would grow the bacteria, they would have nutrients. Eventually the test tube would get cloudy because our number of bacteria would go up. But then I'm done with my bacteria. I've plated them on whatever agar plates I need, so I'm done with it. And so I set it aside. But now I'm not adding nutrients. I'm not getting rid of waste. And I'm not adding new bacteria, not letting any leave. So I have a truly closed population. Well, it doesn't take too long for that bacteria just to die, right? Because when we think about it, if I'm not feeding them and if I'm not getting rid of the toxins, like for us, if we had 20 humans living in a room and we sealed it off and just let oxygen, the gas exchange happen, besides the lack of food, we would have waste. So those things would kill us very quickly, right? So we need to have a way to remove those things. All right, so growth curves. So when we talk about growth curves, there are 4 components to a growth curve that we need to be aware of. Okay, so what a growth curve does is it shows the change in population over a period of time. So when I look at this growth curve, I see my time here is on the x-axis, and then this is the size of a population here on the y-axis. Populations start with a lag phase, all right? So lag phase is a period of slow growth, and that's thought to be because the population's taking a while to get used to its environment. So we have this slow period of growth, okay? So that's what's going on here. This is lag phase. Growth phase, we have this increased size in our population. So the number of individuals being born in that population is greater than the number of individuals dying, right? So we have this drastic increase in population size. If we think about us as humans, we're probably somewhere around here, okay? Now, we don't follow this curve exactly, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Then we get to stationary phase. So stationary phase is kind of this plateau that a population can reach. Not all populations reach the stationary phase, and that's basically where our number of individuals being born into the population is the same as the number of individuals dying. And then we have death phase, this drastic reduction in the population, and that's where more individuals are dying than are being born. So like I said, not all populations show every part of this growth curve. So this particular growth curve is more what we would see in the bacteria culture that I had, right? They took a while to grow, then a whole bunch grew. I never took away the waste, I never added anything, and eventually they all died. Okay? All right. So this is just a real quick explanation of that I already talked about, right? So lag phase, a period of adjustment. Growth phase, fastest rate, a period of exponential growth. Stationary phase, number being born is the same as the number dying, and that reaches this plateau. And then the death phase, the number dying is greater than the number being born. Okay, so we see this death phase when there's just not enough to sustain the population and there's too much waste. Okay, so not every population ends this way. All right, so those are just the fundamental parts of a growth curve, population growth curve, but we're going to talk about 2 specific growth curves that we need to know. In order to do that, we need to know a few terms. So the first term we need to understand is something that's called carrying capacity. And we can use the symbol capital K to indicate carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the maximum population that can be sustained indefinitely by a given supply of resources. So a certain area would have a carrying capacity for a certain population, right? So X number of caribou could be sustained by this population. So sustained means indefinitely sustained, not sustained for a year, but over a long period of time. Now, if conditions change, that carrying capacity could go down, right? So if there's like 5 years of drought, if that population is not going to be sustained the same population can't be sustained, right? So the population carrying capacity would go down because there's less resources available. Okay. So when we reach carrying capacity, it means our rate of increase and rate of decrease match, and we have this flat, okay, um, line in our population growth curve. Okay, so what affects carrying capacity? So when we think about carrying capacity, what we want to think about is when I have a growth curve. So here we have this, right? So this is time and this is population size. So N. Here we go. Okay. And our population, don't know why that happened. Try that again. Okay, so here we have our population, and our population's going up like this, right? So that's happening over there, and then I can have these little blue dots, or that blue line there. That's carrying capacity. So that says for that area, that's as much as what can be supported by this population. So if N, our population size, goes above that, it can no longer support that population. So carrying capacity is the maximum population that can, over a period of time, be sustained. Okay. All right. So when I think about carrying capacity, okay, so that's this K value here. That's the straight line across. That's the maximum population that can be supported for a period of time in that particular region. Okay. Well, what's going to increase carrying capacity? What's going to push up the population size? And the things that push that up are, or what pushes that up is biotic potential, right? So, why is that not drawing? Oh, because I have an eraser on. There we go. So pushing up against the carrying capacity is biotic potential. Okay. That's increasing our population size. That's the potential maximum birth rate of a population. So what affects that? The things that affect that maximum birth rate are how many young an individual has at once. Okay. So let's think about us. We're humans. So every one time we reproduce, we typically have one. If we think about a mouse, they can have anywhere between 8 and 12. Okay. Young each time they reproduce. Capacity for survival. Well, for us, pretty likely that that one individual is going to survive, right? For mice, maybe they lose 2 or 3. Okay. So if they had 12, they might be down to 9. Procreation. How many times a year can you reproduce? For us, maximum 1. For a mouse, they reproduce about every 3 to 6 weeks. I think it's every 6 weeks-ish. Okay. So think about over a year, how much a human population will go up versus how much a mouse. And then when do they reach reproductive age? For a mouse, they reach reproductive age, I think it's 6 weeks. Okay. Oh, they can reproduce every 3 weeks, right? So their baby, it takes 3 weeks for them to go through gestational period. It takes us 9 months. So if you think about us humans, if you think about 2 humans starting at the beginning of the year, by the end of the year, we might have 1 more human. If we think about 2 mice starting at the beginning of the year, and then in 3 weeks, they have 6 babies, or sorry, have 9 babies that survive. Let's say 5 of them are female. Then we have, at that point, when those guys reach reproductive age in 6 weeks, all the females can have babies, and they can have 9 babies. And then their females can have 9 babies, and their females can have 9 babies, besides the other females that can continue to have 9 babies. So by the end of 1 year, our mouse population has grown exponentially, but our human population has not. So when we think about the difference between biotic potential, relatively speaking, humans have a very low biotic potential, but a mouse has a very high biotic potential. So what's pushing up that maximum population that an area can support? Biotic potential is going to push that up. Okay, so that keeps pushing it, but then we have to think about what decreases it. Okay. So what decreases it is something referred to as an environmental resistance. Okay, so if we think about the other part of this graph, environmental resistance is what's going to hold that population down. Okay, so we have environmental resistance. ER. Okay, so biotic potential is pushing up, environmental resistance is pushing down, and where those two meet, that's the carrying capacity, right? So what's environmental resistance? That's anything that limits the population size. So things like predation, disease, how much food is available, all of those things will limit the size of a population in a particular area, okay? All right. Environmental resistance is changing, right? And that's why carrying capacity can change, because we could have a year of drought. We could have a year of flooding. We could have all of these different things that are going on in a population, okay? Now, there's two types of environmental resistance that we need to be aware of. The first is referred to as density independent factors. These are factors that are independent of the density of a population. Okay, so I have a couple of examples here. So, whoops, human disturbances. Human disturbances is one. Us causing a fire, us causing deforestation to occur, all of those different things. Okay, here we go. So an increased density of the population does not cause these factors to occur. So if all of a sudden our population gets more and more dense, that doesn't cause us to have a tornado. That doesn't cause us to have a fire, right? That doesn't cause a flood to happen. So an increased density does not cause these factors. They can happen, right? And they can cause a population size to go down, but it doesn't cause them. A drought is not caused by high density in a population. Okay. So when we think about density independent factors, they tend to be abiotic, right? They tend to be the non-living components, right? So anything associated with weather, fire, all of those types of things. Okay. Density dependent factors, on the other hand, these are factors where increased density does cause them to happen. All right. So increased density does cause these factors to happen. So let's look at a few of them. So I have competition here. Okay, so let's look at my first little image here. So we have competition. Well, competition, if we have a more dense population, that means our resources become more limited, which means we're going to have increased competition within our species. Predation. Well, where are the predators going to go? They're going to go to a population that's more dense versus one that's less dense because they're more likely to get a meal. Disease. This is why we are doing social distancing right now and why we're doing online learning. Because as our population is more dense, the closer we are to one another, the more likely we're going to spread disease from one to the next, right? The more spaced out we are, the less likely we're going to spread disease from one to the next. Okay, so that's why we are all very spread out right now. Okay, so as our population becomes more dense, we're at increased risk of disease. So you look at a place like New York with an incredibly dense population, their risk of disease is very, very high as a result of that. And that's what we're seeing. Okay, all right. So these tend to be, so when we talk about environmental resistance, these tend to be abiotic factors, right? Sorry, biotic factors, factors that involve living things. So predation, disease, competition, all of those things, okay? Depleted food supply, okay? So what are we talking about here? We're talking about carrying capacity. So that's the maximum population. That's that straight line that means a capital K. Maximum population that can be supported in a certain environment. biotic potential, so the more biotic, the higher the grade of the biotic potential, the more the population is going to rise. Okay, environmental resistance pushes down on that K. Okay, so that's going to push down on it. So we have less growth in our or less increase in our population. And the balance between those two is what gives us our carrying capacity. Okay. When we think about environmental resistance, there's density independent factors and density dependent factors. So you have to know the difference between those two. All right. Any questions so far? Alrighty. Let us move on. Okay. So I told you we had to know two different growth curves. I'm just going to get rid of some of my circles here. So the first one is called the logistic growth pattern. And it's also known as the S-shaped curve because it's sort of shaped like an S. So population stabilizes at the carrying capacity. So what this means is the population goes through lag phase, goes through growth phase, and then kind of just hangs out at the carrying capacity and doesn't go up or down at that point. Okay. There is no death phase. All right, so if we think about an S-shaped curve, we have a lag phase, we have a growth phase, we have a stationary phase, but no death phase. Okay. Now, this particular growth curve is typical of a group of organisms that are referred to as K-selected populations, and we're going to talk about what that means. All right, but we have to understand that S-shaped or logistic growth pattern, K-selected populations. All right, so here's an example of what this curve looks like. Okay, so kind of like an S. So we start off here. So we're looking at this part of the graph first. Okay, so just through the chat, what do I call that part of the graph? Good, so that part of the graph is referred to as the lag phase. Okay, what do I call this part of the graph? Okay, good, so that part of the graph is called the growth phase. And then this part of the graph is the stationary phase. Okay, so the thought is behind these K-selected populations is that they're going to reach this phase, the stationary phase, and then have no further growth. They're just going to keep kind of a dynamic equilibrium up and down, just kind of along that stationary phase. And there's no death phase. Okay. Now, the thought is, and we'll see why this is in a couple minutes, but the thought is that this is where we are, that we're K-selected organisms, and this is maybe somewhere where we're at. We're not quite sure where we are on that X. We know that our population is growing exponentially. I think we're somewhere around 7.5 billion people on our planet. Okay. It's going huge, right? So even though we have people dying of COVID-19, that's not going to have a massive impact on our population growth. So our population is going up significantly. So we might be here and we might reach this carrying capacity. Now, when we're going to reach that is anybody's guess. We might reach that carrying capacity if we are, in fact, a K-selected species, as we'll see that we probably are. There's some human ecologists that think we'll reach that at 2020. Some think we'll reach it in 2100. Some think we'll reach it when we reach a 12 billion population. But the difficulty with that, with us, is we have different pockets of humans that live around our planet, right? So we have humans that live in North America, and we have a pretty big footprint here in North America. and we have people that live in small countries in Africa. And there was a session once that was put on, and the idea behind it is if everyone lived like we did here in Canada, like the average person lives in Canada, our carrying capacity for our planet, for human beings, would be 2 billion people. But if everyone lived like the average person lives in Rwanda, the carrying capacity would be 50 billion people. So because we have such a diverse footprint and standard of living, it's very difficult to determine what our actual global carrying capacity for the human population will be. So time will tell. All right. So case-selected populations. So when we talk about case-selected populations, our biggest characteristic that we need to understand with what fits into that category are organisms that have a low biotic potential. Okay? And as we said when we talked about mice, compared to mice, we have an extremely low biotic potential. Okay, so that's the fundamental definition of individuals that fall into that category of being case selected. All right, but we do have a couple other things that we can talk about of characteristics that are common with individuals in that population. Okay, so slow breeding. So what this is saying is we breed so slowly, so as we go from one generation to the next, we're not going to overshoot our carrying capacity. We'll just nicely kind of hang on to the carrying capacity. Okay, have an S-shaped growth curve. Okay, or a logistic growth pattern. Longer parental care. So individuals that are case selected tend to take long care of their children. So you think about us, we typically care for our children until they're 17 to 18 years of age. Not in the same way as when you guys were babies, but still taking care of, right? Late age of reproduction. We can maybe start having babies at 12. We don't, but we could. Mice, we're looking at 6 weeks, right? So we have a much later age of reproduction. We're bigger. So bigger organisms tend to be case selected. Organisms with longer life expectancies tend to be case selected. So here's a couple of examples. So chimpanzees, humans, whales, tropical rainforest trees, right? Big trees that grow for a long period of time, the redwood forest trees, all of those types of things. So I wanted to include vegetation as well because they can also be case selected. Okay, so those fall into the category of what we refer to as case selected species. All right. So if we take a look at this, this is just an example of what we would look at for a logistic growth pattern or an S-shaped curve. So that's what I'm seeing here, right? So here's my S-shaped curve. And notice it's not exactly a flat line. It's a little fluctuation along where that carrying capacity is. So this line here is referred to as carrying capacity, okay? So if we look at all of these different types of environmental resistance that are pushing down on the carrying capacity, in this example, all of these are one type of environmental resistance. They're either density independent or they're all density dependent. So what do you think? Are they density independent factors or density dependent factors? Any guesses, guys? Yeah, they're density dependent. They depend on density. Density causes them to happen, right? If we have a more dense population, then oxygen's used up more, right? If we have a more dense population, there's going to be less food, so more competition. If we have a more dense population, we're going to have more disease. More dense population, more predators are going to come around because it's easier prey, less space, right? So all of those depend on density. They're density dependent. Okay. All right, so now we're going to look at a different type of growth curve. So this is called the exponential growth pattern, also called the J-shaped curve because it kind of looks like a J. So rapid growth of a population overshoots the carrying capacity. So this is like a boom and bust population. And what we need to remember with this one has no stationary phase. Okay, so we looked at the logistic growth pattern. There was no death phase. This one doesn't have a stationary phase. And this is the type of growth curve that we're going to see in our selected populations. All right, so let's take a look at what this graph looks like. All right, so we can kind of see this sort of J curve in the shape, but we see a boom and a bust. So let's just look at the components of this and make sure we know what all the different parts of the growth curve are. So let me just circle different parts here. So what's that part of the growth curve? Okay, so we're looking at the lag phase. Perfect. What's this part of the growth curve called? Okay, good. Growth phase. What's this part of the growth curve called? Not stationary, not that one. Death phase, that's right. So that one's death phase. Okay, so in this type of population, we don't have a stationary. Okay, so let's think about how this works. We have this rapidly increasing population, right? So let's think about our mice, right? So every generation of mouse, all the previous generation and then the new babies and all those can have more babies. So instead of just going up a little bit with each generation, it's this massive increase. So that means we can go from maybe we're here and the next generation, all of a sudden we're right here. All of a sudden the population doesn't have enough food, has too many predators, has a lot of disease, and that's where we see that bam, death phase happen. This is really common. You might notice in your neighborhood with rabbits. There might be some years where it just seems like there's rabbits everywhere, and then other years when the rabbit population doesn't seem as big. And that's that boom or bust. Goes up, goes up, goes up, goes up, something happens, crashes. Now, we'll notice that most populations don't crash till the population has none. They don't crash to extinction typically. They just kind of go up, crash, and then go up again and crash. Okay, and that's typical of what we see in these R selected populations. Okay, that have the J-shaped curve. All right, so let's look at R selected populations. So when we look at our R selected, make sure I'm not covering up that. Okay. These are organisms, and how we really want to define these guys, they have a high biotic potential. Okay, so that means they breed really, really, really quickly. Okay, so that's one of the most defining characteristic, high biotic potential. So they rapidly breed, so they tend to crash, right? They breed so quickly, they overshoot that carrying capacity and then crash. So they have this J-shaped curve. Other characteristics that are typical of these types of populations, little to no parental care, right? Now we do see a little bit of parental care here in the bottom right corner, right? We've got a rat, it looks like, taking care of the little rat babies, and they nurse, but they don't nurse for very long, okay? Early age of reproduction. So we think about our mouse example, after 6 weeks, they can have babies. Tend to be smaller, tend to have a shorter life expectancy. So some examples, dandelions. So most weeds would fall in the R selected. They can reproduce really quickly. Aphids, locusts, so insects, mice, cockroaches. So usually rodents like mice fit into the category of R selected populations. Okay. Oops. All right, so I'm just going to erase this. Okay, so maturation time. So we talked about this, so I'm just going to fill in the blanks here for you. So K selected tends to be a longer time to mature. R selected is shorter before they reach maturity. Death rate tends to be lower in K selected, higher in R selected. Number of offspring per birth. K selected is not very many. R selected is usually a lot. K selected, they reach reproductive age later in life than R selected. Organisms tend to be larger in K selected, tend to have a longer life expectancy, tend to reproduce a lot slower than R selected, and tend to give more parental care. Okay. All right. This here, typically for this class, I'll usually ask a few questions about humans, but it's not totally curricular, so we're just going to skip past the next 2 slides and just look at this. So, whoops, predation versus predator. So when I take a look here, predator-prey growth curve. Now, even though in this example we have the rabbit, which would be an R selected, and we've got the lynx, which would be a K selected. Well, that means that the lynx population should go up and should level off, right? But the thing is, sometimes that doesn't happen when we have a predator-prey cycle. So when I look at this graph here, what I'm seeing is the lynx, the population size of the lynx totally depends on the population of the hare, okay? So when the hare population is really high, the lynx population's high. As soon as the hare population drops, the lynx population drops. So the population of the predator depends on the population of the prey. So if we have this predator-prey relationship and they're totally intertwined with one another, we can see that a K selected can have this up and down in their population size because they're depending on the prey population. So as the predator population goes up, the prey population goes down. As the prey population goes up, the predator population will go up. Okay. Any questions? All right. Competition. So competition for resources. So there's 2 terms that we need to know: inter-specific competition and intra-specific. And they sound very similar, so it's really, really important you know the difference between those. So inter is a prefix that means between. This is competition between different species for limited resources. So my image here, we've got a lion and we've got some hyenas. So they're competing for this dead animal. Looks like a wildebeest. Okay. So 2 different species depend on the same resource. So for example, clover and grass might be competing for nutrients in the soil or sunlight. Ducks and geese, different species, they're competing for nesting sites, right? Interspecific. So the other one is intraspecific. Okay, so this is competition within. So intra means within. Within a population. Okay, so between members of the same species for limited resources. So you could have fir trees growing next to one another, and one fir tree, they're both competing for access to sunlight, for access to nutrients. Penguins competing with each other for fish. So very often when we have a situation with inter-specific competition, we also have intra-specific competition occurring as well. Okay, but you have to know the difference. So inter, we're looking at different species. Intra, within the same species. Okay. All right. Predation. So you guys all know about what predation means because you've been learning this since elementary school. Whoops. So involves an organism which hunts and kills. That is the predator. Another organism, which is the prey. So you guys should know predation and the predator-prey relationship. So we see here in the upper right-hand corner, we've got our grizzly bear, who is the predator, and our fish here, who's the prey. And here we've got a gazelle here, that's our prey, and our, what looks like a cheetah, is our predator. Okay, so just be aware of that relationship, which you should be because you have learned this for many years. Okay, so the predator benefits while the prey is eaten. Okay, coevolution, again, another curricular, non-curricular topic, so we're just going to quickly go through that. Okay, so predation. How does the prey survive? So in the curriculum, we have mechanisms of survival. But these are techniques that are used by prey, but they're also used by predators, right? Polar bears are white so they can sneak up on their prey, right? That helps them to sneak up and be unseen. But the different types of mechanisms we have are ones that you should understand. But again, these are things that you've seen before. Camouflage. So we see our little spider in the upper right-hand corner there. And that spider is this little yellow one. It has a name that I don't remember offhand. But there's our little spider hiding. It's camouflage. It blends into the background. So prey will blend in to avoid being eaten. Predators will blend in to avoid being seen by their prey. Flight, so running away. So we see our little rabbit in the picture, but a lot of animals, gazelles, antelopes, deer, whatever, they'll all run away from their prey. Rabbits tend to run in a zigzag pattern, right? That tends to be their method, is to try to confuse their predator. Fighting is another method. Okay, so we see here we've got, looks like a wildebeest trying to kick off a lion. Okay, so fighting, hippos will fight, right? Elephants will fight. Trickery. So here's one example of trickery. So sometimes they'll make a noise or change their body size. So what we're seeing here in the bottom right-hand corner is a frilled lizard, and they'll just blow up their frill and make them look quite a bit larger than what they normally are. And that'll kind of freak out and scare the predator to think that they're actually going against this really big creature. In fact, they're not. Protective colors. Okay, so we have the poison dart frogs. So they have these really bright colors, and the bright colors are a warning: stay away, or if you eat me, you're going to get really sick and you might die, right? So that's usually what nature says. So really bright is usually really bad. So that helps for species to avoid eating them. Mimicry is when they look like something that is something that people want, or organisms, predators want to avoid. So over here, we see this is actually a fly. Looks kind of like a wasp, but it's actually a fly. So predators will avoid eating it because they think it's a wasp. Over here, this looks an awful lot like the snake in the previous slide, except this is a milk snake, and the previous slide was a coral snake. Coral snakes are deadly, and these milk snakes are not, right? So when the red and the yellow bands are touching each other, that's actually a coral snake, which is the deadly one. So it looks an awful lot like one, but it isn't. Grouping is another method. So we see here our muskox are grouping and avoiding being eaten by the little wolf there. All right. And the last one we're going to look at here is the producer-consumer relationship. And again, this is one that you guys have seen for many, 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 many years. So when we look at this relationship, we have a consumer. So usually we're thinking of our consumer as being a plant eater. Whoops. And usually we're seeing our producer as being a plant, unless we're talking about chemosynthesis, which happens in the bottom of the ocean, which we don't need to worry about. Okay, so the consumer benefits, well, the producer is being eaten. So we see a little koala bear getting all drugged up, eating its nice eucalyptus leaves. One benefit is to the plant, though, is that the producer can spread its seeds through the feces of the consumer. All right, so that was our very quick lesson for today. So we will finish off population ecology on Friday. I'll post a worksheet probably tomorrow that'll include some of Friday's stuff that you'll have the weekend to do. Any questions before we end her off for today? All right, well, don't forget to do the population genetics quiz that is on Moodle. And if you have some time, I would go outside. It looks like the sun's trying to shine a little bit, and it'll all make us feel not so trapped. All right. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you on Friday.